It was a crisp autumn afternoon in 2024 when I first drove into Hollow Creek, a remote coastal town that seemed to exist on the edge of reality. I'd just begun my studies at Hollow Creek University, eager to escape my mundane life and immerse myself in a new adventure. I shared my small dorm room with Derek, a childhood friend who had a habit of collecting strange artifacts and old newspapers. After a particularly grueling day of unpacking and sorting through Derek's eclectic collection, I suggested, "Hey, how about we check out the nearby shore? I heard it's beautiful this time of year." Derek, buried under a mountain of dusty books and forgotten trinkets, barely glanced up. "Not today, man. I've got too much to sort through. You go ahead." I had always lived inland, far from any ocean, and the idea of exploring the coast was thrilling. With excitement bubbling inside me, I grabbed my jacket and set out alone, eager to experience the shoreline and its mysterious charm. As I arrived at Hollow Creek Beach, the sight before me was hauntingly beautiful. The setting sun cast a fiery orange glow over the waves. A cool breeze swept through, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay. Seagulls circled above, their cries mingling with the soft murmur of the waves. The contrast of the warm sky and the cooling sea created an almost otherworldly atmosphere. I wandered along the shore, letting my feet sink into the moist sand. I stumbled upon a large, weather-worn rock and decided to sit, taking in the tranquil beauty. As twilight settled, the sky turned into a dark purple canvas dotted with the first stars. The air grew colder and a shiver ran down my spine. I began to prepare to leave. Something strange caught my attention. The shoreline had shifted subtly, and the sea seemed to be encroaching upon the land more aggressively than I had noticed before. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I had misjudged the tide. The water was now up to my knees, and the current felt stronger. Panic set in as I tried to make my way back to the shore. A sudden, powerful wave surged forward, knocking me off balance. I stumbled, feeling a sharp sting in my foot. I looked down to see a deep gash, but the urgency of escaping the rising water pushed aside my concern. I fought against the tide, eventually scrambling out of the water and heading back to my dorm, drenched and shivering. When I burst into our dorm room, Derek looked up from his cluttered desk with a mixture of surprise and concern. "You went to the beach?" he asked, noting my soaked appearance. "You look like you swam in the ocean." Before I could answer, Derek's face turned pale. "There was someone there, behind you. I saw her." My teeth chattered as I tried to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about?" "There was a woman," Derek insisted, voice trembling. "She had long, wet hair and was wearing a yellow dress. She was right behind you, walking through the water." I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see someone. The room was empty, save for the mess of Derek's belongings. "You must be seeing things," I said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Maybe I just caught a cold or something. The next few days were a blur of fever and confusion. I woke up to find my body burning with an intense fever, my muscles aching as if I had been through a strenuous workout. Derek's worry was palpable as he hovered around me, trying to offer comfort and encouragement. By the third day, his concern escalated, and he rushed me to the nearest hospital. The hospital was a cold, sterile place, and I lay in bed, feeling like I was trapped in a fever dream. Derek sat beside me, flipping through channels on the TV. An emergency news report caught our attention. "Authorities have discovered the body of a young woman who drowned at Hollow Creek Beach," the anchor's voice crackled through the speakers. "She was found nearly a week after her disappearance. Her clothing was described as yellow, and she had long hair." Derek's eyes widened, and he turned to me with a look of horror. "That's her," he whispered, "the woman I saw." My heart pounded as I tried to piece together the horrifying connection. The location where the woman's body was found was eerily close to where I had been struggling against the tide. The realization that I might have had a close encounter with a ghostly presence left me feeling chilled to the bone. Despite my worsening condition, the doctors couldn't explain the nature of my illness. The fever persisted, and my health seemed to deteriorate with each passing day. By the fourth day, fever began to subside, and my physical condition improved, but the eerie sensation of the ghostly woman lingered. As the years passed, I graduated and left Hollow Creek, but the memory of that fateful night never fully left me. Each visit back to the town brought a mix of nostalgia and dread. The beach remained a place of bittersweet beauty, a reminder of the ocean's allure and its hidden dangers. The whispering waves and the distant cries of seagulls became a haunting refrain. I would walk along the shore, hoping to find solace, but instead finding the ghostly presence of the woman with the yellow dress lingering in the back of my mind. Hollow Creek Beach was more than a picturesque spot. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was unsettlingly thin. The ocean, with its inviting appearance, hid secrets beneath its surface, secrets that once almost claimed me. Years later, I returned to Hollow Creek for a reunion with old friends. As I walked along the beach, now familiar yet still unnerving, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The air was colder and the tide was higher than usual. My thoughts drifted back to that night, and the whispers of the waves seemed to carry a message from the past. I stopped at the same boulder where I had sat years ago and gazed out at the darkening sea. The waves whispered and roared, and for a moment, I felt the presence of something beyond the veil of reality. The ghostly woman's story had become a part of me. A reminder that the ocean's allure came with hidden dangers and untold mysteries. As I turned to leave, I noticed something in the sand. An old, yellow dress, partially buried. The faded, hauntingly familiar pattern. The realization hit me with a jolt. Some stories never truly end. They simply wait for the next chapter to begin. The shore, with its whispering tides, would always hold a piece of my past. A place where the boundaries between life and death were disturbingly close, and where the silent tide of fate had once nearly claimed me. It was the autumn of 2019 when Ken and his colleague Mike embarked on a routine business trip to the sleepy outskirts of a small town in New England. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning shades of amber and crimson, and the roads were lined with towering, ancient trees that seemed to swallow the light. Their work was mundane, a series of meetings and inspections that left them both yearning for something more. Something to break the monotony of their lives. As the day drew to a close and they started their journey back home, the sky darkened earlier than usual. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a blanket of inky darkness. They drove along Route 19, a long stretch of road that wound through dense forests and isolated farmlands. It was a road that locals rarely used after sunset, a road with a history of strange occurrences and whispered rumors. Mike, a man of science and logic, broke the silence. "You know, they say this road is haunted," said with a smirk, glancing at Ken from the passenger seat. "People talk about a woman, ghost, who appears at night. They say she's a spirit who died in a car accident years ago." Ken chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. "Come on, Mike. You don't actually believe in that stuff, do you? It's just a bunch of stories to scare the kids." Mike shrugged. "I don't know, man. We've been driving for hours, and this road is starting to get to me. It's dark, and it feels different, you know? Like something's watching us." Ken shook his head, dismissing his friend's unease. "Relax. We'll be home soon. Besides, we drove through here this morning, and nothing happened." But as the miles stretched on, the road grew darker, the trees on either side closing in like the jaws of some great beast. The headlights of their car barely pierced the thick, oppressive blackness. Silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, Ken slowed the car, his heart skipping a beat as he noticed something in the distance. A figure was walking slowly in the middle of the road. A woman. She was dressed in a short skirt and a blazer, like she was heading to or from work. Her steps were measured, almost deliberate, and she seemed oblivious to the car approaching. Is she crazy? Walking in the middle of the road at this time of night? Ken muttered, grip on the steering wheel tightening. Mike leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. Maybe she needs a ride. Pull over, let's see if she's okay. Ken nodded and honked the horn to get her attention, but she didn't react. Car crept closer, and still she showed no signs of acknowledging them. Mike rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" The woman didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. There was something unsettling about her, something that made Ken's skin crawl. Mike leaned further out the window, trying to get a better look at her face. "Hey miss, are you okay?" It was then that he saw her face clearly, illuminated by the car's headlights. His breath caught in his throat, and his face drained of color. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes were black pits, and blood was seeping from her empty eye sockets and mouth. It was a grotesque, horrifying sight that made his blood run cold. "Jesus Christ!" Mike screamed, recoiling in terror. His voice trembled, and his whole body stiffened with fear. "Ken, drive! Drive now!" Ken, still unaware of what Mike had seen, asked, "What's wrong? What did you see?" "Oh, Ken, it's a ghost. She's a ghost," Mike shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He was almost incoherent, his words slurred with terror. "She's right behind us. She's chasing us." Ken's heart raced as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was no longer in front of the car. She was now standing behind it, her lifeless eyes fixed on them. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and blood continued to pour from her empty socket. Ken slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped down the road. Mike was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear. "She's real, Ken. She's real, and she's coming after us." Ken's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination, something that wasn't real. But Mike's terror was palpable, infectious, and soon Ken found himself gripped by the same fear. As they rounded a bend in the road, Ken caught sight of the woman again. This time, she was standing directly in their path, her arms outstretched as if she was trying to stop the car. There was no time to react. Ken swerved to avoid her, but it was too late. The car clipped her, and there was a sickening thud as she was thrown into the air. Ken's hands shook as he tried to regain control of the car, but it was no use. The car careened off the road, slamming into a power pole with a deafening crash. The force of the impact shattered the windshield, and the car's front end crumpled like paper. Everything went silent. The world outside was dark and still. The only sound, the soft ticking of the engine cooling down. Ken's head was spinning, his ears ringing from the crash. He turned to Mike, who was slumped in his seat, blood trickling down his forehead. "Mike, are you okay?" Ken's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Mike didn't respond. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, staring blankly ahead. Ken's heart sank as he realized his friend was dead. Before he could fully comprehend what had happened, he saw her again. The woman. She was standing just outside the car, her face pressed against the shattered window. Her black eyes bore into his soul, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Blood dripped from her face, pooling on the ground beneath her. Ken's breath hitched as the woman's hand reached through the broken window, her cold, clammy fingers brushing against his skin. He recoiled, trying to push her away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed with fear. "Why?" The word escaped his lips in a trembling whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she opened her mouth wider, and a long, bloodied tongue slithered out, reaching for him. Ken's eyes widened in horror as the tongue wrapped around his neck, tightening like a noose. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as darkness closed in around him. And then, everything went black. The sound of distant sirens echoed in the night, stark contrast to the eerie silence that had fallen over the scene of the accident. Emergency lights flashed red and blue, casting an otherworldly glow on the twisted wreckage of Ken's car. The once peaceful road was now a chaotic mess of shattered glass, splintered metal, and bloodstains. Paramedics rushed to the scene, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. The first responder, a seasoned EMT named Sarah, approached the car cautiously. She had seen her fair share of accidents. Something about this one felt different. There was an unsettling chill in the air, a sense of dread that hung heavy over the scene. As she peered into the car, her breath caught in her throat. The driver, Ken, was slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and lifeless. But it was the passenger seat that made her blood run cold. Mike's body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, frozen in a final expression of sheer terror. What the hell happened here? Sarah muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. She motioned for her partner to help her extract the bodies from the car. As they worked, the police arrived, led by Detective James Miller, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for solving even the most baffling cases. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in every detail. Skid marks on the road, broken power pole, the position of the car. It all told a story. But it was a story that didn't make sense. "Looks like they lost control and crashed into the pole," one of the officers said, shaking his head. "But the speed they were going, they should have survived." Miller frowned, kneeling beside the car. He noticed the blood smeared on the inside of the windshield, the shattered glass, and something else. Long strands of dark hair tangled in the wreckage. He pulled on a pair of gloves and carefully retrieved a piece of the hair, examining it closely. "This doesn't belong to either of them," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Something's not right here." As they continued their investigation, a tow truck arrived to haul the wreckage away. The driver, a burly man with a weathered face, hooked up the car and began the slow process of lifting it onto the flatbed. But as the car was raised, something fell from underneath it, landing with a soft thud on the pavement. Miller approached the object cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The object lay motionless on the cold pavement, partially obscured by the shadows cast by the flickering lights. As he drew closer, the beam of his flashlight revealed what had fallen, a large, blood-stained cloth. But there was something odd about it. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was wrapped around something solid. Detective Miller carefully knelt down and began to unwrap the cloth, his gloved hands trembling slightly. With each layer he peeled back, a sense of dread grew within him, tightening like a vice around his heart. When he finally uncovered what lay inside, he recoiled, curse escaping his lips. It was a severed human hand, the skin pale and lifeless, the fingers curled as if they had tried to grasp something in their final moments. The hand was mangled as though it had been caught in some terrible machinery, the bones visible through the torn flesh. But what chilled Miller to the bone was the small gold ring still clinging to one of the fingers, delicate band with a single, tiny diamond. It looked eerily out of place on the mutilated hand. "Get the coroner here now," Miller barked, his voice sharp with urgency. One of the officers, already pale from the sight, nodded and hurried to call it in. As Miller stood, trying to make sense of this gruesome discovery, his thoughts were interrupted by the faintest sound, a soft, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. He whipped around, his flashlight scanning the area, but there was nothing there. The road was empty, the only movement the swaying of the trees in the breeze. He was about to dismiss it as his imagination when the sound came again, this time closer, more distinct. It was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakably human. The words were slurred, incoherent, but they sent a shiver down Miller's spine. "Help me." Miller's blood ran cold as he realized the voice was coming from under the car. He motioned for the tow truck driver to stop, and then, with cautious steps, approached the underside of the vehicle. He knelt down, his flashlight flickering as it struggled to penetrate the darkness beneath the car. "Who's there?" Miller called out, his voice firm but laced with unease. The only response was another whisper, this one more urgent, more desperate. "Please help." Miller hesitated for only a moment before he lay down on the ground, ignoring the damp cold seeping into his clothes. He edged his way under the car, the flashlight beam leading the way. As he crawled deeper, the smell hit him. Rotting flesh, decay, and something else. Something that smelled faintly of sulfur. His heart pounded in his chest as he finally saw the source of the voice. There, wedged between the undercarriage and the road, was a woman. But this was no ordinary woman. Her body was twisted in impossible angles, her limbs broken and contorted as though she had been crushed by some unimaginable force. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those hollow black eyes, stared at him with a mixture of agony and fury. Miller's breath caught in his throat. It was the woman from the crash, the same one Mike had described in his final frantic moments. She was real, and yet, she shouldn't have been. "Help me," the woman rasped again, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate through the very marrow of Miller's bones. He scrambled back, fear clawing at his mind. This was impossible. There was no way she could still be alive. Not in this state. He had seen countless bodies in his career, but nothing like this, nothing that defied all logic and reason. As he backed away, the woman's hand, still clutching the gold ring, reached out toward him. Her fingers were broken, the nails torn and bloody, but she was still trying to grasp him, pull him closer. "Please," she whispered, her voice now filled with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. "Help me." Miller felt a sudden surge of pity, mixed with the paralyzing fear that had gripped him. He didn't know what to do. Everything in him screamed to run, to get away from this nightmare. Something held him there, rooted to the spot. Before he could make a decision, the tow truck driver spoke, snapping him back to reality. "Detective, is everything okay?" Miller blinked, the spell broken, turned his head, momentarily losing sight of the woman. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just give me a minute." But when he turned back to the spot where the woman had been, she was gone. The space beneath the car was empty, save for a few smears of blood on the road. The hand, the whispers, the woman, it had all vanished as if it had never been there. Miller scrambled out from under the car, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He stood up, his legs shaking as he tried to steady himself. The other officers were looking at him with concern, but he waved them off. There's nothing under there," he lied, his mind racing. "Just get the car out of here." As the tow truck pulled the wreckage away, Miller stood alone on the side of the road, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He tried to rationalize what had happened, tried to convince himself that it had been some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But deep down, he knew that what he had seen was real, and it terrified him. The days following the accident were filled with unanswered questions and mounting unease. The coroner's report on Mike's body was inconclusive. While the cause of death was listed as trauma from the crash, there were unusual injuries that couldn't be easily explained. Deep lacerations that didn't match the wreckage, and bruises that seemed to form patterns across his skin. Patterns that looked eerily like handprints. As for Ken, the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing. His lungs were filled with blood, but there were no external injuries to suggest how it got there. Coroner, an experienced pathologist, could only describe it as a spontaneous hemorrhage, something he'd never seen before in someone with no prior health issues. Detective Miller buried himself in the investigation, trying to piece together what had happened on Route 19. He interviewed anyone who might have information: the locals, families of the deceased, even the few people who still lived near that cursed road. But all he got were more rumors, more ghost stories about the woman who haunted the stretch of highway. The stories were all eerily similar. A woman dressed in business attire who would appear out of nowhere, always at night. She would wander the road, her face hidden in shadow, and those unfortunate enough to encounter her would meet with a tragic fate. Some said she was the spirit of a woman who had died in a car accident years ago, her body never found, her soul trapped in eternal torment. Others believed she was something older, something more sinister, a malevolent entity that fed on fear and despair. Miller wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but after what he had seen, he couldn't dismiss the possibility. The evidence, or lack thereof, was gnawing at him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange occurrences that couldn't be explained by logic alone. He started digging deeper, searching through old records and news archives. It was a slow, painstaking process, but eventually he found something. A newspaper clipping from 1985 detailing a fatal car crash on Route 19. The victim was a young woman, Sarah Thompson, who had been driving home late one night when she lost control of her car and collided with a power pole. The same power pole that Ken and Mike had crashed into. According to the article, Sarah's body was never recovered. The car was found mangled beyond recognition, but there was no trace of the driver. The only thing they found was her purse, lying in the grass beside the road, and a single gold ring that had been flung from the wreckage. Miller's heart raced as he read the article. This was it. This was the connection he had been looking for. But as he continued to read, his excitement turned to dread. The article mentioned that Sarah had been engaged to be married, the wedding set to take place just a week after the accident. Her fiancé, devastated by her death, had taken his own life not long after. The two were said to be inseparable, soulmates bound together by love, and now, it seemed, by death. Miller leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's spirit was still out there, trapped on that road, reliving the moment of her death over and over again. And anyone who crossed her path was doomed to suffer the same fate. But why now? Why had she suddenly become so violent, so vengeful? Had something triggered her? Or was it just the passage of time, the decades of lingering unrest that had twisted her spirit into something dark and dangerous? Miller knew he had to find out. Couldn't let this continue. Couldn't let more innocent lives be lost to the haunting of Route 19. He decided to return to the scene of the accident, to confront whatever it was that haunted that road. The night was thick with fog as Miller drove back to Route 19, the headlights of his car barely cutting through the dense mist. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he approached the site where the accidents had taken place. The road seemed even darker, the trees more oppressive, as though the very landscape was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. He parked his car on the side of the road, just a few yards from where Ken's vehicle crashed. The night was deathly quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He stepped out, his flashlight in hand, and started walking down the road. Every step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown, each footfall heavy with the weight of impending doom. Miller's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, his ears straining to catch even the faintest whisper of sound. As he walked, he began to notice something strange. The fog was thickening, swirling around him like a living thing, and with it came a chill that seeped into his bones. It was as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant, the warmth of the summer night replaced by a cold, unnatural presence. Then he saw her. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. But as he drew closer, the details became clearer. The woman was standing with her back to him, dressed in the same short skirt and blazer that Mike had described. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back in tangled waves. She stood perfectly still, her posture unnaturally rigid, as though she were waiting for something, or someone. Miller's breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening around the flashlight. He knew it was her, Sarah Thompson, the ghost that had haunted this road for decades. But now she was real, standing right in front of him. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Sarah Thompson?" The woman didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there, as though she hadn't heard him. Miller took a step closer, his heart pounding. "Sarah, I know what happened to you. I know you died here on this road. But it's over now. You don't have to stay here anymore." Still, the woman didn't move, but something in the air shifted, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of Miller's neck stand on end. "Please, Sarah," he pleaded, taking another step forward. "Let go. It's time to rest." For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and suffocating. And then slowly the woman began to turn. Miller's breath hitched as she faced him. Her face was as he had seen it before, pale, lifeless, with those hollow black eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Blood trickled from her eyes and mouth, a grotesque mockery of tears, and her expression was one of sorrow mixed with fury. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the fog. Miller took a step back, his heart racing. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. You can move on. There's nothing holding you here anymore." But the woman shook her head slowly, her black eyes never leaving his. "You can't leave." And then, before Miller could react, she lunged at him. Her hands, cold and clammy, wrapped around his throat, her grip impossibly strong. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as she squeezed tighter, her face inches from his, those black eyes filled with hatred and despair. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice now a desperate plea, as though she were caught between her desire for vengeance and her need for release. Miller struggled, his hands clawing at hers, but it was no use. The coldness seeped into his skin, his strength waning as the world around him darkened. He was on the brink of unconsciousness when, in a final desperate attempt, he reached out with his other hand and touched the ring on her finger. For a split second, everything stopped. The woman froze, her grip loosening, her black eyes widening in shock. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, she released him, stumbling back with a strangled cry. Miller collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his vision swimming as he looked up at her. The woman was staring at the ring on her finger, her expression one of confusion and pain. For the first time, Miller saw something in her eyes other than rage, something human. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak. She looked at him, her black eyes softening, the blood on her face beginning to fade. "I wasn't ready," she murmured, her voice now filled with sorrow. And then she was gone. Fog began to lift, the oppressive chill in the air dissipating as if it had never been there. The road was empty once more, the only sound the distant hum of crickets in the night. Miller sat there for a long time, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He had confronted the ghost of Sarah Thompson, and somehow he had helped her find peace. But at what cost? And would it truly be the end of the haunting? As he finally stood and made his way back to his car, couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt lighter, the darkness less menacing. Perhaps, he thought, Sarah had finally found the rest she deserved. But as he drove away from Route 19, his thoughts still racing, couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. And for a brief moment, just before the road disappeared from view, he thought he saw her standing there, watching him with those sad black eyes. When he blinked, she was gone, leaving only the dark, empty road behind. In the weeks that followed, Route 19 returned to its usual quiet state. The accident stopped, the rumors of the ghostly woman faded, and life in the small town resumed its normal rhythm. But for Detective James Miller, things would never be the same. Couldn't forget what he had seen, what he had experienced on that haunted stretch of road. The image of Sarah Thompson, her twisted form, her black eyes, haunted his dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the ordinary world. He knew that the case was closed, but there was nothing more to investigate. But deep down, also knew that the haunting of Route 19 was just one of many mysteries that defied explanation, and that somewhere, out there in the darkness, other restless spirits waited for their stories to be told. As Miller continued his work, solving cases, uncovering truths, he couldn't help but wonder how many of those truths lay hidden in the shadows, beyond the reach of logic and reason. And how many more would he encounter before his own journey came to an end? Only time would tell. And as for Route 19, it remained just as it had always been. Quiet, unassuming road winding through the New England countryside. But for those who knew its history, it would forever be a place of fear, of tragedy, and of restless spirits who could not find peace. And for Detective James Miller, it was a reminder that sometimes past refuses to stay buried. The Forgotten Lake. It was the summer of 1987, in a small, sleepy town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and the nearest city was a good hour's drive away. A place where secrets could be buried deep, both in the ground and in the minds of the townsfolk. For three kids, Jake, Tommy, and Billy, it was the summer that would change everything. It was the summer they discovered the lake. Jake was the oldest of the trio, at 12 years old. He was the leader, one who always came up with the wild ideas that Tommy and Billy would follow without question. Tommy, a year younger, was the brainy one, the thinker. He was the type who would ask questions when Jake didn't, though he rarely got any satisfying answers. And then there was Billy, the youngest at 10. He was small for his age, quiet, and often the butt of the others' jokes. But he was fiercely loyal, and no one else could touch him if Jake and Tommy were around. The summer days were long, and the boys filled them with adventures in the woods that bordered their town. They built forts, climbed trees, and sometimes even dared to venture into the old mines that everyone else avoided. But there was one place they had never gone before, a lake, hidden deep in the woods, just on the edge of the forest. The older kids whispered about it in school, calling it the Forgotten Lake. Place where strange things happened, place to be avoided at all costs. But Jake wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially when he could see the gleam of fear in Tommy's eyes whenever the lake was mentioned. Billy, as usual, was along for the ride, trusting Jake implicitly. So, one hot, sticky day in July, the three boys set off into the woods, determined to find the lake that no one ever talked about. They walked for what felt like hours, the trees growing denser, the air cooler as they moved deeper into the forest. The usual sounds of the woods, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Even Jake, who prided himself on never being scared, began to feel uneasy. "Maybe we should turn back," Hami suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake scoffed, though his voice was less confident than usual. "What, are you scared? It's just a lake, Tommy. Nothing to be afraid of." Billy, trailing behind, said nothing, his eyes darting around nervously. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. It was as if the forest itself didn't want them there. Finally, they reached a clearing, and there it was, the lake. It was smaller than they had imagined, more of a large pond than a lake, but it was undeniably beautiful. The water was dark, almost black, and perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the gloomy sky above. The air around the lake was cooler, almost chilly, despite the oppressive summer heat. "See? It's just a lake," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He picked up a rock and tossed it into the water, watching as it skipped once, twice, and then sank with a soft plop. The ripples spread out across the surface, distorting the reflection of the trees around them. Tommy and Billy watched in silence, their unease growing. There was something about the lake that wasn't right, something that made their skin crawl. But Jake, ever the leader, wouldn't let them back out now. "Come on, let's check it out," he said, stepping closer to the water's edge. Tommy hesitated and followed, and Billy, not wanting to be left alone, reluctantly trailed behind. They stood at the water's edge, peering into the murky depths. The water was so dark they couldn't see the bottom. Something about it was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. "Look," Jake said suddenly, pointing at something just below the surface. Tommy and Billy leaned in closer, their eyes straining to see. At first, it just looked like a shadow, but then it moved. Slowly, lazily, like a fish gliding through the water. "Is that a fish?" Billy asked, his voice tinged with awe. Jake grinned. "Maybe, or maybe it's something else." Tommy frowned, his curiosity getting the better of him. "It's too big to be a fish, and look how it's moving. Fish don't move like that." Billy shivered, stepping back. "I don't like it. Let's go home." Jake turned to him, his grin widening. "What's the matter, Billy? Scared of a little fish?" Billy flushed, embarrassed but still uneasy. "It's not that. Just feels wrong." But Jake wasn't listening. He was already pulling off his shoes, rolling up his pants. "I'm gonna catch it," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Tommy hesitated. "Jake, maybe we shouldn't." But Jake was already wading into the water, the coldness of it making him gasp. It was deeper than he had expected, coming up to his knees after just a few steps. He glanced back at Tommy and Billy, who were watching from the shore, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. "Come on, you guys. Don't be such wimps," Jake called out, taking another step deeper into the water. But as soon as he did, something changed. The air around the lake seemed to grow even colder. Trees on the far side of the lake bending as if blown by a sudden wind. The water rippled, though there was no breeze, and a low, ominous hum began to vibrate through the air. "Jake, get out of there," Tommy shouted, his voice panicked now. But Jake didn't move. He was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror as he stared down at the water. It's got me," cried out, his voice trembling with fear. Billy screamed, but it was lost in the sudden roar of the wind that came out of nowhere, whipping around them with a fury that sent the trees shaking and the water churning. Tommy ran to the edge of the lake, reaching out a hand to Jake, who was struggling against something unseen below the surface. "Grab my hand," Tommy shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Jake reached out, his hand trembling, but just as their fingers brushed, he was yanked back into the water, force that sent him splashing under the surface. Tommy screamed, falling to his knees at the water's edge, frantically searching the dark water for any sign of his friend. Jake was gone. The water was still again, the wind dying down as suddenly as it had appeared. The lake was calm, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just swallowed their friend whole. "Jake! Jake!" Tommy screamed, tears streaming down his face as he pounded the ground in frustration and terror. But there was no response, no sign of Jake. The lake remained eerily silent. Billy, pale and trembling, was too terrified to speak. He backed away from the water, his eyes wide with horror. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to get help." But Tommy didn't move. He was still staring at the water, as if hoping Jake would suddenly resurface, laughing it off as some kind of joke. Deep down, he knew Jake was gone. The lake taken him. When they finally made it back to town, breathless and terrified, no one believed them at first. The sheriff, grizzled old man named Hank, dismissed their story as the wild imagination of kids who had wandered too far into the woods. But when Jake didn't come home that night, a search party was organized. They searched the woods for days, but there was no sign of Jake. The lake, when they finally found it, was just as the boys had described: dark, still, and unsettling. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of what had happened. It was as if Jake had simply vanished. The town was never the same after. The story of the forgotten lake spread, and soon, no one dared to go near it. The woods around it were declared off limits, and the lake was left to its dark secrets. But the nightmares began soon after. Tommy and Billy, the only ones who had seen what happened, were haunted by visions of Jake, his face twisted in terror, calling out to them from the dark water. They heard his voice in the wind, saw his reflection in the water whenever they looked too closely. And then, one by one, the other kids who had known Jake began to disappear. First, it was Sarah, a girl who had a crush on Jake. Then it was Mike, the boy who had teased Billy for being scared. Each one vanished without a trace, the only connection being that they had all known Jake. The town fell into a state of fear and paranoia. Parents kept their children close, warning them never to go into the woods, never to speak of the forgotten lake. But the nightmares continued, spreading like a disease through the town, until it seemed that everyone had seen the lake in their dreams, felt its cold pull. Tommy and Billy, now the last of the trio, were left to live with the guilt of what had happened. They had tried to forget, tried to move on, but the lake wouldn't let them. Called to them in the night, a dark, whispering voice that promised to reunite them with their friend. It was the fall of 1988, just over a year since Jake had disappeared, when Tommy made up his mind. He couldn't take it anymore, the nightmares, the guilt, fear. He had to go back to the lake, had to face whatever it was that had taken Jake. Maybe, he thought, he could find a way to bring him back, end the nightmare once and for all. Billy tried to talk him out of it, tears in his eyes as he begged his friend not to go. But Tommy was resolute. "I have to do this, Billy. I can't live like this anymore." And so, one cold October night, Tommy left his house and made his way through the woods, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at him as he pushed forward. But he didn't stop, not even when the wind began to howl, carrying with it the faint sound of Jake's voice. The lake was just as he remembered it, dark, still, and silent. The air was colder here, the water reflecting the pale light of the moon. Tommy stood at the water's edge, his heart pounding in his chest, fear clawing at his throat. "Jake?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the soft lapping of the water against the shore. But Tommy could feel it. Presence, the cold, malevolent force that had taken his friend. It was watching him, waiting. "I'm not afraid of you," Tommy said, though his voice betrayed him. He took a step closer to the water, then another. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, swirling around him with a ferocity that made his teeth chatter. He didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. "Give him back," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Please, just give him back." The water rippled, a small wave lapping at his feet, and then slowly something began to emerge from the depths. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape rising from the water. But as it drew closer, Tommy could see it clearly. Jake, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his body soaked and lifeless. Tommy's breath caught in his throat, tears welling up in his eyes. "Jake," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. But the figure before him was not his friend. It was something else, something dark and twisted, wearing Jake's face like a mask. It smiled, cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down Tommy's spine. "Tommy," it whispered, its voice a mockery of Jake's. "Come join me." Tommy stepped back, his heart racing, but the thing that looked like Jake moved closer, its eyes locking onto his. "Don't you want to be together again, just like before?" it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Tommy shook his head, backing away from the water, but it was too late. The thing lunged at him, its cold, wet hands grabbing him, pulling him towards the water. Tommy screamed, struggling, but its grip was too strong. The water was icy, numbing his limbs as it pulled him under, and then as the darkness closed in around him, Tommy heard a voice. A voice that wasn't Jake's, but something older, something ancient and malevolent. "You will never leave," whispered, its voice echoing in his mind as the water filled his lungs, drowning out his screams. The town never found out what happened to Tommy. They searched, of course, but like Jake and the others, he was never found. The lake remained, silent and still, a dark secret hidden in the depths of the woods. Billy, the last of the trio, left the town soon after, unable to bear the memories that haunted him. He never spoke of the forgotten lake again, but the nightmares followed him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the friends he had lost. And so the lake remained, forgotten by the world, but not by those who had lived through its horrors. It waited, patient and silent, knowing that someday, someone would come again, drawn by the same curiosity, the same fear. And when they did, the lake would be ready. The Cursed Hollow. 20 years ago, before I became a seasoned nurse with stories of my own, I was just another curious young woman, eager to learn and unafraid of the unknown. I've seen things that defy logic, things that cling to you long after you leave the room. But there's one story that haunts me to this day, a story not just of death, of something far worse. I first heard this story from a colleague, an older nurse who had worked in the most remote parts of the country. One late night, when the hospital was quiet and the only sound was the distant hum of machines, she shared with me a tale so chilling, it still makes my skin crawl. It was a story of a small, forgotten village deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where something evil once took root. It was the fall of 1998, and the medical team was sent to a secluded mountain village to conduct a health survey. They were preparing to open a new medical center there, and my colleague, who I'll call Sarah, was among the volunteers. The village was isolated, reachable only by a narrow, winding dirt road that cut through the dense forest. Sarah and the team were welcomed by the village head, older man named Henry. He had a gruff demeanor, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, a mix of fear and resignation. He led the team to the small infirmary, a simple wooden building that had seen better days. "Stay here," Henry said, his voice low and rough. "If you need anything, I'll be in my house." The team leader, Dr. Stevens, a man in his late 40s with a calm, authoritative presence, nodded. He asked Henry where they could find herbs and other local remedies, and Henry assigned a young woman named Lily to assist them. Lily was quiet, almost too quiet, and she avoided eye contact as she guided them around. Later that day, as the team was setting up their equipment, a commotion broke out outside. Voices were raised, and the sound of a woman's desperate cries echoed through the village. Sarah and the others rushed outside to see what was happening. A woman, disheveled and hysterical, was kneeling in the dirt, pleading with Henry's wife Martha. "Please let him go. He's not himself. He's sick." Martha's expression was one of cold indifference as she tried to shoo the woman away. But when she saw the medical team, her face hardened. "Go back inside," she snapped. Dr. Stevens stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The woman on the ground looked up, tears streaming down her face. "My husband, please, you have to help him. He's dying." Henry appeared, his face a mask of anger. "This is none of your concern," growled. "The man is possessed. We have our own ways of dealing with it." "Possessed?" Dr. Stevens repeated, incredulous. "We need to see him. Now." Henry's eyes flashed with something dark, but he relented. "Fine," spat, "but don't say I didn't warn you." The woman, who introduced herself as Emily, led them to a small shack on the outskirts of the village. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, and even the birds seemed to avoid this place. As they approached, Sarah could feel a chill creeping up her spine. Inside the shack, the air was damp and heavy. In the corner of the room, a man was tied to a bed, his body shivering despite the warmth of the room. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, sunken, and filled with a terror that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "This is my husband, Tom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "He's been like this for weeks. It started with a small wound on his head after he came back from the woods, but then he changed. He started having these fits, screaming about bugs crawling inside his skull. He's not the same man anymore." Dr. Stevens approached the bed cautiously. Tom's breathing was shallow and his body was covered in sores, some of them oozing a dark, foul-smelling liquid. His eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment they locked onto Sarah's. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, as if something had reached out from those empty eyes and touched her soul. "Please, you have to help him," Emily begged, clutching Dr. Stevens' arm. "He's dying." Dr. Stevens nodded, his face grim. "We'll do everything we can," he said. But there was a note of doubt in his voice, one that Sarah didn't miss. As they left the shack, Henry and Martha were waiting outside, their expressions unreadable. "I told you," Henry said. "He's possessed. There's nothing you can do." "We'll see about that," Dr. Stevens replied, his tone brooking no argument. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of Tom's hollow eyes haunted her, and she kept hearing his faint, desperate whispers in the darkness. She could almost feel the bugs crawling under her own skin. The next day, the team began treating Tom with what little resources they had, but nothing seemed to help. His condition only worsened, and soon he was thrashing violently in his bed, screaming about the bugs, the horrible bugs. Sarah could see the fear in Emily's eyes as she watched her husband slip further away from her. Henry and Martha were no help. They refused to let the team take Tom to a proper hospital, insisting that the problem was spiritual, not physical. Instead, they brought in a man named Old Joe, a local shaman who claimed to have the power to drive out the evil spirit. Old Joe was an imposing figure, tall and gaunt with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He wore a necklace of animal bones and carried a staff adorned with feathers and charms. He entered the shack without a word, his expression grim. The team was forced to stand back as Old Joe began his ritual. He chanted in a low, guttural voice, waving his staff over Tom's convulsing body. Sarah watched in horror as Tom's eyes rolled back into his head, his body arching off the bed as if something was trying to rip its way out of him. Emily was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching Sarah's arm so tightly it hurt. "Make it stop," she begged. "Please, make it stop." But there was nothing they could do. The ritual went on for what felt like hours, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and the sound of Old Joe's chanting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Tom collapsed back onto the bed, his body still and silent. "It is done," Old Joe said, voice weary. "The spirit has been driven out." But as he spoke, cold winds swept through the shack, and Sarah felt a deep, primal fear grip her heart. Tom's eyes fluttered open, but they were no longer empty. They were filled with something else, something dark and ancient. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. Tom was not free. Over the next few days, Tom's condition deteriorated rapidly. His sores spread, turning black and necrotic, and a foul stench filled the shack. Emily refused to leave his side, even as the other villagers began to avoid her, whispering about the curse that had befallen her family. The medical team did what they could, but it was clear that Tom was beyond saving. Infection, whatever it was, had spread too far. His body was shutting down, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But then, something strange started happening. The sores on Tom's body began to pulsate, as if something was moving beneath the skin. Sarah watched in horror as tiny, wriggling shapes pushed against the surface, trying to break free. Dr. Stevens ordered everyone out of the shack. It was too late. The sores burst open, releasing a swarm of tiny black insects that filled the air with a deafening buzz. Sarah and the others fled, but Emily stayed behind, screaming as the insects swarmed over her. By the time they managed to get back inside, it was too late. The shack was empty, save for the lifeless bodies of Tom and Emily. The insects were gone, leaving behind only the grotesque remains of their hosts. The villagers were in an uproar. They blamed the medical team for bringing the curse upon them, and Henry was quick to fan the flames of their anger. He insisted that the only way to appease the spirits was to leave the village and never return. Dr. Stevens argued, but it was clear that the villagers were beyond reason. They were terrified, and fear had a way of making people do desperate things. That night, as the team packed their belongings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The village was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel road. But then, as they reached the edge of the village, they heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. Sarah froze, her heart racing as she scanned the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the forest looming over them. "Let's go," Dr. Stevens urged, his voice tight with fear. But as they turned to leave, they saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were the villagers, but they were no longer human. Their bodies were twisted and deformed, their skin covered in the same black sores that had claimed Tom and Emily. Sarah screamed as the figures lunged at them, their mouths open in a silent, agonized wail. They ran, but the creatures were faster, their claws tearing at their flesh as they tried to escape. One by one, the team fell, their screams echoing through the night. Sarah could hear Dr. Stevens calling out to her, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. She ran, her lungs burning, her legs trembling with exhaustion. But no matter how fast she ran, she could feel them behind her, their hot breath on the back of her neck. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, she saw it, a small clearing ahead, bathed in the pale light of the moon. She pushed herself forward, desperate to reach the safety of the light. But as she stepped into the clearing, she realized too late that it was a trap. The ground gave way beneath her, and she fell into a deep, dark pit, the walls lined with jagged rocks and bones. She tried to climb out, but the walls were too steep, too slick with blood. She could hear the creatures above, their guttural growls filling the air as they circled the pit, waiting for her to tire. And then, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she heard a voice. A soft, whispering voice that sent chills down her spine. "You cannot escape," it said. "You belong to us now." Days passed, and the villagers returned to their homes, first seemingly lifted. Sarah was never seen again. Some say she was taken by the spirits. Others say she was buried alive in the pit. The truth is far worse. For deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there is a place known as the Cursed Hollow, where the trees grow tall and twisted, and the air is thick with the stench of death. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of her screams, echoing through the woods, as she begs for release from the darkness that has claimed her soul. But there is no release, no escape from the horrors of the Cursed Hollow. For once you enter, you become a part of it, forever trapped in the nightmare that haunts those dark and twisted woods. And so the story of the Cursed Hollow became a cautionary tale, whispered among the villagers who knew better than to venture into the woods. But for those who didn't listen, who thought they could outsmart the darkness, they found themselves lost, never to be seen again. For in the end, the Cursed Hollow always claims what it is owed. As Sarah finished her story, her eyes distant and hollow, I realized that this was no ordinary tale. It was a warning that some places are better left alone, some things are better left forgotten. But it was too late. The darkness had already claimed me, just as it had claimed her. And now as I sit here, writing this down, I can hear them. The whispers, the growls, the sound of claws scraping against the door. I know they're coming for me. And I know that when they do, there will be no escape. For the darkness never forgets, and it never forgives. It only waits, patiently, for the next soul to claim. The Babysitter's Nightmare. The air was crisp with the early bite of autumn as I walked up the stone pathway leading to the grand house that loomed ahead. I'd always found it a little too quiet in these parts, for the houses were so far apart that you could scream and nobody would hear. It was a Friday evening, and I was back at the Randalls' estate for another weekend of babysitting. Mr. and Mrs. Randall were a well-off couple in their late 40s who frequently traveled on weekends, leaving their two children, James and Jessica, in my care. James was 7, energetic, inquisitive, and a bit of a troublemaker when left to his own devices. Jessica, 5, was a quieter child, often content to play with her dolls in the massive playroom dedicated just for her. I'd grown fond of them both over the past few months, and the Randalls had treated me well, providing me with a spacious guest bedroom and free reign over their impressive kitchen. I couldn't complain. It was an easy job, and the pay was more than generous. That night, the house was as silent as ever, the only sounds coming from the crunch of leaves under my feet as I approached the front door. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles, with a large pond sitting serenely in the middle of the property. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something unnerving about the stillness that always seemed to hang over the place, like the calm before a storm. The first night went smoothly. I played with James and Jessica until their bedtimes, 7:30 for Jessica and 8:30 for James. They were good kids, really. Jessica spent most of the time with her dolls, and James was content to immerse himself in his video game. I'd spent enough weekends here to know the routine like the back of my hand. Once the kids were in bed, the house was mine. I had developed a habit of spending my evenings in the pool house, a luxurious little building across the pond that housed a bar, pool table, and a huge TV. It had become my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind, watch movies, and chat with my friends without worrying about disturbing the kids. That evening, after the kids had fallen asleep, I made my way to the pool house. The path was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the moon and the scattered garden lights. The autumn air had a sharp chill, and I pulled my coat tighter around me as I walked. The pool house was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. I settled on the plush couch, put on the movie White Chicks for some mindless entertainment, and texted a few friends to pass the time. It was about an hour into the movie when the intercom buzzed, startling me so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. The intercom connected the main house to the pool house, feature the Randalls had installed for convenience. I hadn't heard it go off before, and the sudden noise made my heart leap into my throat. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed the button to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice echoing slightly in the small room. "Can you come here?" It was Jessica's voice, small and trembling. "What's wrong, Jess?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "I heard noises," she whispered. Fear palpable, even through the intercom. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile she couldn't see. "I'm coming, sweetie. Stay in your bed, okay?" I grabbed my coat and hurried back across the property to the house. The night seemed darker than before, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me as I punched in the code to unlock the door. Inside, the house was still and silent. I made my way to Jessica's room, where I found her curled up in bed, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, a well-worn bunny she called Mr. Floppy. Her big brown eyes were wide with fear. "I'm here, Jess," I said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "What did you hear?" "Thumps, like someone was walking around," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the shadows in the corners. "Probably just the house settling, sweetie. Old houses make noises sometimes. There's nothing to worry about." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I stayed with her until she calmed down, tucking her back into bed and humming softly until her eyes finally fluttered shut. As I made my way back to the kitchen, a soft creak sounded from somewhere behind me, like a floorboard protesting under weight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just the house, I told myself, but the unease had rooted itself firmly in my mind. Back in the pool house, I tried to shake off the lingering fear. I cranked up the volume on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out my anxiety, and tried to focus on the movie. But I couldn't stop thinking about Jessica's frightened voice, the way she had clung to Mr. Floppy like he was her only lifeline. And then, the intercom buzzed again. I jumped, my heart pounding in my ears as I rushed to answer it. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Silence. "Jessica?" I tried again. "James?" Nothing, but I could hear breathing. Someone was on the other end, but they weren't speaking. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't a prank the kids would pull. They were asleep, or at least they should have been. "Hello?" I called out one last time, but the line went dead. I stared at the intercom for a long moment, my mind racing. Couldn't be the kids. Just couldn't. I grabbed my phone and dialed Kelsey, my best friend. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep or alcohol. Maybe both. "Kels, something's wrong," I said, my voice trembling. The intercom. Someone was on the other end, but they didn't say anything. "I'm really freaked out." "You're just being paranoid," Kelsey slurred, clearly unimpressed by my concerns. "It's probably nothing." "No, you don't understand. There was breathing. Someone was there." Kelsey sighed. "You're just spooking yourself. Calm down, okay?" But I couldn't calm down. As I stared out the large window that overlooked the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway lights in the house flicked on, one after another, like someone was walking through. "Kelsey, there's someone in the house," I whispered, my voice barely audible as terror gripped me. "What? Are you serious?" "Yes," I breathed. "There's a man. He's in the hallway." Panic surged through me as I watched a large, shadowy figure step into the light of the hallway, his silhouette unmistakable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he moved with a deliberate slowness that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him as he paused in front of one of the windows, his head turning slightly, as if he was looking directly at me. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear Kelsey's frantic voice on the other end of the line. "Kelsey, I need to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. "I have to go." I hung up before she could respond and immediately dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped the phone. The operator's calm, steady voice did little to soothe my rising panic as I explained the situation. "There's a man in the house," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know who he is, but he's in there with the kids. Please, you have to hurry." As I spoke, I kept my eyes glued to the house, praying that James and Jessica were still asleep, that they hadn't seen him yet. But then, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A scream, high-pitched and filled with terror, echoing through the intercom. It was Jessica. "No," I whispered, dropping to my knees in the pool house, my phone slipping from my grasp. "Please, no." The operator's voice was a distant hum in my ear as I stared helplessly at the house, tears streaming down my face. Couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could hear was Jessica's scream, replaying over and over in my mind. The sound of Jessica's voice broke through the haze of terror that had paralyzed me. She was crying, calling my name through the intercom, her voice filled with fear. "Jessica," I shouted into the intercom. "I'm here. Get your brother and get out of the house. I'm scared," she sobbed. "There's a man." "I know, sweetie, I know, but you have to be brave. Get James and come outside. Run, Jessica, now." I didn't wait for her response. I bolted from the pool house, sprinting across the yard toward the main house. Cold night air stunned my lungs, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting to those kids, getting them out of that house. When I reached the door, Jessica and James were already there, their eyes wide with terror. I grabbed their hands and pulled them outside, not stopping until we were back in the pool house, where I locked the door, pulled the blinds shut. "We're safe now," I whispered, trying to comfort them, but I wasn't sure if I was saying it for their sake or mine. We huddled together in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the TV, which I'd forgotten to turn off. I held Jessica close, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs, while James clung to my other side, his face buried in my shoulder. "Shh, it's okay," I whispered, even though I didn't believe it myself. "Police are on their way. We're gonna be okay." It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching the house. Relief flooded through me, and I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "They're here," I said, my voice trembling. "We're safe now." I led the kids to the door, where we were met by a female officer who quickly ushered them to one of the patrol cars. Another officer took me aside, asking me questions about what had happened, but I could barely focus on his words. My mind was still reeling, my body trembling from the adrenaline. And then they brought him out. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had been twisted into something grotesque. His eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion, as they swept over the scene, landing on me for a brief, horrifying moment. He smiled, A slow, sickening grin that sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. "Is this the man you saw?" the officer asked, his voice pulling me back to reality. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with fear and disgust. They put him in the back of a police car, but not before he cast one last glance in my direction, his eyes locking onto mine. I'll never forget that look. The way it seemed to see straight through me, into the deepest parts of my soul. The Randalls arrived soon after, their faces pale and drawn with worry. They hugged their children tightly, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that the bad man was gone now. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the way they kept glancing at the house as if expecting him to return at any moment. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words felt hollow, inadequate. How could I describe the terror of that night? How could I explain the feeling of helplessness that had gripped me when I realized the kids were in danger? In the end, I simply told them that I couldn't come back, that I was too scared to stay in that house again. They understood, of course. They didn't blame me, but I could see the sadness in their eyes, the guilt that they hadn't been there to protect their children. I went home that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that twisted grin, those empty eyes. I heard Jessica's scream, replaying over and over in my mind. The house that had once seemed so grand and beautiful now felt like a prison, filled with shadows and fear. The Randalls pressed charges. With their wealth and influence, they ensured that the man would never see the light of day again. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Fear was there, lodged deep in my heart like a splinter that I couldn't remove. I couldn't stop thinking about those kids, how scared they must have been, how close we'd come to losing everything. I knew they were safe now, but the memories of that night haunted me, refusing to let me go. I never babysat again after that. Couldn't. Every time I heard a noise in the night, every time I walked past a dark window, I felt that cold, creeping fear wash over me. In the end, it wasn't the man's face that haunted me the most. It was the memory of those children's voices, terror in their eyes, the helplessness I felt as I realized that I might not be able to protect them. That fear has stayed with me, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint buzz of the intercom, the echo of a scream that never really goes away. Whispers in the dark woods. The wind howled through the ancient trees as I parked my truck at the edge of the vast woodland. I was 28, seeking a bit of solitude, a break from the humdrum of daily life. So I decided to spend a weekend camping in the local woods with my trusty beagle, Reggie. It was November, a time when the days were still warm, but the nights could turn bitterly cold, a stark reminder of the impending winter. I had come prepared, packing my portable fire pit, lighter fluid, and an axe for chopping wood. I had my tent, sleeping bag, and a small supply of food that would last the 2 days we planned to stay. There was a lake nearby, so I brought my fishing gear, hoping to catch dinner. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and the soft rustling of leaves underfoot. After hiking about a mile from the truck, I found a small clearing near the lake, an ideal spot for my campsite. The silence was comforting, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds and the distant sound of water lapping at the shore. I set up my tent and gathered some wood, keeping an eye on Reggie, who was sniffing around, his tail wagging with excitement. The lake glistened under the afternoon sun as I cast my line, hoping for a bite. Reggie sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the water, occasionally glancing towards the dense forest behind us. After a while, I noticed him staring intently into the woods, his body tense, ears perked up. His tail had stopped wagging. He was fixated on something. Something I couldn't see. "Come on, Reggie, it's probably just a squirrel," I said, trying to reassure myself as much as him. But Reggie's demeanor didn't change. He kept staring, his body stiff, low growl rumbling in his throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. After an hour of fishing with no real luck, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The path was narrow, winding through the trees, offering glimpses of the water through the branches. When we reached the far side of the lake, I glanced back at the campsite. My heart skipped a beat. 2 figures were moving near my tent, their shapes barely discernible in the distance. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew what I saw. 2 people, and they were at my campsite. "Reggie, let's go," I said, my voice trembling as I picked up the pace. We hurried back along the path. Crunch of leaves beneath our feet, the only sound in the stillness. When we reached the campsite, my worst fears were confirmed. The tent zipper was open, flaps fluttering in the breeze. Someone had gone through my things. Strangely, nothing seemed to be missing. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. The thought of strangers lurking in the woods, watching me, filled me with dread. I decided it wasn't safe to stay there. I packed up my gear and moved the campsite further up the lake, hoping to put some distance between myself and whoever, or whatever, had been there. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I chopped wood and started a fire, flames crackling and spitting in the growing darkness. Reggie stayed close, eyes darting nervously towards the woods. Something was out there, and it wasn't just the usual wildlife. I could feel it too, presence in the trees, watching, waiting. Fire was warm, its light flickering against the surrounding trees, casting eerie shadows that danced with the wind. I fed Reggie and heated up a can of chili for myself, the smell filling the air. We sat by the fire in silence, the only sounds coming from the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the unease grew stronger. Reggie's ears twitched at every little sound, his eyes never straying far from the darkness beyond the firelight. I grabbed my journal and started writing, hoping to distract myself. I wrote about the peacefulness of the woods, the beauty of the lake, and the strange sense of dread that had settled over me, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. There was something wrong, something I couldn't put my finger on. Reggie suddenly started barking, his sharp yelps echoing through the woods. I jumped, dropping my pen as I turned towards the sound. My heart raced as I peered into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Reggie kept barking, his hackles raised, teeth bared as he stared into the trees. I grabbed his collar, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. His eyes were wide with fear, his body tense as if ready to attack. I decided it was best to put out the fire and get inside the tent. There were people out there. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I doused the flames, the sudden darkness swallowing us whole. The only light came from the small lantern inside the tent as I crawled into my sleeping bag. Reggie curling up beside me, still on high alert. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. Reggie's ears twitched at every sound, his eyes darting around the tent, following something I couldn't see. "What is it, Reggie?" I whispered again, hoping for some comfort, but none came. He started growling, a deep, low sound that rumbled in his chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a deer, or perhaps a bear. But then, the more terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if it was a person? The hours passed slowly, the darkness outside pressing in on us. Reggie had finally calmed down, growling subsiding into soft whimpers as he lay beside me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Then, in the dead of night, Reggie started growling again, this time louder, more urgent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, trying to hear what he was hearing. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic whistling, coming from somewhere outside the tent. It was the kind of whistle you'd use to call a dog, playful, teasing sound. It sent a jolt of fear through me. Reggie growled louder, his body tense as he stared at the tent zipper. Someone was out there in the darkness, whistling as if they were calling him. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. Whoever had been at the campsite earlier hadn't left. They were still out there, watching us, baiting. Whistling continued, growing louder, closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of footsteps approaching the tent. My hands shook as I grabbed Reggie, trying to keep him quiet, but he wouldn't stop growling, his teeth bared, ready to attack. Footsteps stopped right outside the tent, just inches away from where we were sitting. I held my breath, terrified that whoever was out there could hear the pounding of my heart. The only sound was Reggie's low growl, vibrating through the air like a warning. Then, the whistling stopped. Silence filled the tent, so thick it was suffocating. My mind raced, imagining all the terrible things that could happen next. I was paralyzed with fear, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Suddenly a loud click echoed through the tent, followed by more footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. Whoever was out there was toying with us, playing some sick game that I didn't want to be a part of. I tried to speak, to yell at them to leave, but my voice came out shaky and weak, pitiful sound that only seemed to encourage them. Footsteps stopped again, this time at the tent's entrance. I could feel the presence of someone standing just outside, their shadow looming over us. Then another whistle, this time so close it felt like it was inside the tent with. Reggie barked furiously, lunging towards the zipper, but I held him back, my hands trembling with fear. "Get out of here!" he yelled, my voice breaking. "I have a gun." The words felt empty, hollow threat that I knew wouldn't scare them off. Footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. Not too far. I could still hear them, pacing just beyond the reach of the light, as if they were waiting for something. The night dragged on, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant sound of an owl hooting in the trees. Reggie had finally calmed down, though he remained alert, his ears twitching at every little sound. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with fear and paranoia. I kept expecting the footsteps to return, the whistling to start again, but the forest remained eerily quiet. My phone had no signal, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. I was trapped in the darkness, with only Reggie for protection. Then, out of nowhere, a piercing scream echoed through the woods. It was a woman's scream, filled with terror and desperation, the kind of scream that chills you to the bone. It sounded like she was far away, but the scream was so loud, so powerful, that it seemed to reverberate through the trees, shaking me to my core. Reggie jumped up, barking furiously, his eyes wide with fear. My blood ran cold as the scream continued, a horrifying wail that seemed to go on forever. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, a sound so raw, so primal, that it made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I had to get out, to find out what was going on. I grabbed Reggie, my flashlight and my boots, and bolted out of the tent. The air was cold, biting against my skin as I stumbled through the darkness, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the thick night. I ran in the direction of the scream. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and twisted trees, disorienting me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Reggie was barking frantically, pulling at the leash as if he was trying to lead me somewhere. But then the scream stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I froze, my flashlight flickering in the darkness. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind, the forest returning to its usual stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No answer. Only the trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't go back to the tent. Couldn't. The fear that gripped me was too strong, too overwhelming. Instead, I ran, my legs carrying me through the dark woods, Reggie by my side. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, the safety of its metal shell a small comfort in the terrifying vastness of the forest. I climbed inside, locking the doors behind me, and sat there, panting, my heart still racing. Reggie was shaking, his eyes wide with fear, but he was quiet now, his barking reduced to soft whimpers. I didn't sleep. Didn't. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside the truck made me jump, my mind conjuring images of shadowy figures lurking in the trees. I kept expecting to hear that whistle again, or worse, the scream. Dawn came slowly. First rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest, which had seemed so menacing in the dark, now appeared peaceful, almost serene. But I knew better. I knew what lurked in those woods, the terror that awaited anyone foolish enough to venture inside. As soon as there was enough light, I grabbed Reggie and headed back to the campsite. The tent stood there, untouched as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could feel the lingering presence, the remnants of the fear that had gripped me the night before. I quickly packed up my things, not bothering to check if anything was missing. I just wanted to get out of there. Leave the woods behind and never look back. It took me half an hour to break camp and load everything into the truck. The forest was still quiet. Eerie silence, a stark contrast to the terror of the night. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. It wasn't until I was miles away, with cell service restored, that I finally felt safe enough to stop. I pulled over to the side of the road and called the local police, reporting the woman's scream and the strange people I had seen in the woods. They took my report, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. After all, it was just a scream in the night, nothing more. But I knew the truth. I knew that something was out there, something dark and sinister that preyed on the unsuspecting. I never went back to those woods. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the terror I had felt, the fear that had gripped me so tightly I could barely breathe. Reggie, too, seemed changed by the experience. He was more skittish, more alert, his ears constantly perked up as if he was always listening, always waiting. Police never found anything. No signs of the people I had seen, no evidence of the scream. It was as if the night had swallowed up all traces of what had happened, leaving only the haunting memories behind. I tried to move on, to forget about that night. The fear lingered, always at the back of my mind. I stopped camping, stopped going into the woods altogether. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by darkness, filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows stretch long and dark, I swear I can still hear it, that soft, melodic whistle, drifting through the air like a ghostly echo of the past. It haunts me, that sound, a reminder that the darkness is never far away, always waiting, always watching. And I know that, no matter how hard I try, I'll never truly escape it. The woods will always be there, a dark, menacing presence lurking at the edges of my mind, whispering in the night, calling me back. But I won't go back. I can't, because I know that if I do, I may not make it out alive.